Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. We are supposed to have two speakers today, Jennifer Maidrand and Xuan Zhang, but one of them, Jennifer, is not here yet. Hopefully, she will be joining us during the course of this panel. So we're going to go ahead and start with Zhang Xuan. She's a candidate of this, a PhD candidate in the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University in China. And she's also assistant researcher in the Center for the Study of Religion and China's National Security at Fudan University. So I will now pass the floor to Ms. Xuan.
Okay, thank you for your kind introduction. Now I'm gonna share my screen. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or evening to our listeners, wherever you are. It's morning here in my place, 4 o'clock in the morning. So my name is Zhang. I'm from School of International Relations and Public Affairs of Fudan University. Firstly, I want to share my gratitude to Professor Fred Lazin. He's now chairing the panel of gender, religion, and politics in Israel. He gave me much help with my English writing and many instructive suggestions for my academic improvement. My presentation today is on the structural power in Israeli-Palestinian relations with a case study of water resource management. I'm speaking here only on behalf of myself, my personal perspectives of this issue. And here is the framework. So my first part is an introduction of the structural power theory. And secondly, I'll explain the distribution of aggregate structural power between Israel and Palestine. And finally, the case study part is of issue-specific structural power in water management. So we know in the long process of confrontation and cooperation, Israeli and Palestinian authorities have gradually formed an asymmetric power relationship. During the peace process in the 1990s, leaders of Israel and Palestinian National Authority signed agreements and established practical cooperation mechanisms in security, custom duties, taxation, and resource management. The cooperation mechanisms shaped the structural power in their bilateral relations, which led to greater Palestinian dependence on Israel. Although the Oslo Accords have been declared dead for many times, and the peace talks stalled for years, the cooperation mechanisms between Israel and the Palestinian Authority remain in effect. So my argument is that the bilateral structural relationship enhanced the existing asymmetrical relationship, which made it harder for the Israeli-Palestinian problems to be solved under a two-state solution. So first, what is the structural power theory? The discussion of power is also a core issue in the study of international relations. In her work of power, the late Professor Susan Strange defines structural power as the power to decide how things shall be done, the power to shape frameworks within which states relate to each other, relate to people, or relate to corporate enterprises. There are 4 domains of structural power in international political economy, namely security, production, finance, and knowledge. These 4 structural domains are independent but influence each other, and under their operation, there are secondary structures as transportation, trade, energy, and welfare. And later in the studying of power relationship between strong and weak states, Professor William Mark Habib, his former advisor to the negotiation support unit of the Palestinian National Authority, he distinguishes between aggregate structural power and issue-specific structural power. He stresses the importance of negotiation tactics, and the issue-specific structural power includes the resources, capabilities, and status of the actor in the specific problem domain. His classification of power takes resources, behaviors, and strategies within special fields as a kind of power alone, which is instructive for analyzing the relationship between strong and weak countries. So based on this theory, my second part is the distribution of aggregate structural power between the two sides. We know interrelated asymmetrical power structures shape the basic framework of Israeli-Palestinian relations. So firstly, about the security structure. Under the Oslo Accords, Israel assumed responsibility for defending itself against external threats within Israel and the Area B and C in the West Bank. This gave Israel absolute authority over the security structure. In the West Bank, Palestinian security forces require Israel's approval to move units within Area A and to coordinate policing, and Israel controls all borders and crossings. And about production structure, in April 1994, the PLO and Israel signed Gaza-Jericho Agreement, including Protocol on Economic Relations in Paris, which laid the foundation for the normalization of economic exchanges between the two sides. It also marked Palestine's economic dependence on Israel, which became the largest trading partner of the authority. An indication of the dependence is the 130,000 West Bank Palestinians with permits issued by the Israeli authorities who work in Israel and its settlements. Israel also controls the fishing areas and the flow of people and goods in and out of Gaza. About finance structure, the protocol also gave Israel control over the Palestinian financial system because it defines the Israeli currency as the main currency and the only means of payment for both sides. Israel strongly influences the Palestinian banking and customs service and can adversely affect the financial situation of the Palestinian Authority by halting the transfers of tax revenues. Tax is the largest source of Palestinian public revenue. However, under the protocol, Israel controls the import of goods from both sides and collects import taxes, national insurance fees, and income taxes on behalf of the authority. Since 2018, the Israeli Defense Minister deducts from taxes it collects for the authority the amount they pay to incarcerated terrorists and their families. Of course, the list is defined by Israel. Israel's collection of custom duties results in a huge budget deficit for the Palestinian Authority. If the Palestinian Authority were to suspend this protocol, it would have to issue its own currencies or to use currencies of neighboring countries. Either outcome would seriously hurt Palestinian economic development. And fourthly, about the knowledge structure. Israel's strength in science and technology enhances its power in the structural domains of military production, finance, resource utilization, energy development, and transportation. Because Israel can use its scientific and technological products to achieve peace and cooperation with neighboring countries. It also enables Israel's control over much of the Palestinian infrastructure. For example, it is able to restrict the access to and to control the development of Palestinian mobile phone services. From 2013 to 2015, the Israeli ban on the introduction of 3G technology caused the Palestinian mobile operators lost about $400 million and $1.5 billion. Israel's technological know-how enables it to enforce its blockade of Gaza by tracking anonymous cryptocurrencies. Israel can prevent the flow of digital money into Hamas accounts. And based on those four primary domains, Israel also has the dominant power in secondary structures of trade, transportation, and energy. Under the protocol, the two sides formed a quasi-customs union with a uniform tariff rate for import and export. However, all goods are shipped through Israeli ports. The frequent delays of the duty transfer resulting in the Palestinian Authority, being unable to pay salaries and disruption in the Palestinian economy. And up until the approval of the new Israeli government last summer, the Netanyahu governments have been restricted trade between Jordan and the West Bank. And about transportation, Israel plans and controls the Palestinian traffic infrastructure in the West Bank. Israel gives priority to Jewish settlers, while the traffic between the West Bank and Israel is restricted by the separation wall and checkpoints. The land and sea borders of Gaza are completely sealed. And with respect to energy, the Palestinian National Authority is almost completely dependent on Israel. Israel imposes duties and surcharges for the gas, oil, and petroleum it supplies to the West Bank. And also, Israel's naval blockade of Gaza gives it sole access and full ownership of the Gaza fields, of the gas fields or of the Gaza coast. And now let's move on to the issue-specific structural power in water management. We know that water resource is one of the focal issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel enjoys asymmetric structural power over access and use of regional water resources. In this specific issue of Palestinian-Israeli water management, Israel's power is mainly embodied in domestic legislation and planning, military and coercive means, and water diplomacy. So first, about the domestic legislation and planning. With regards to surface water resources, Israel drained Lake Hula and constructed the national water carrier. During the 1967 war, Israel gained access to the Banias and Dan rivers and springs of Golan Heights and channeled them into the national water system. The dispute over groundwater stems from the competition for mountain aquifers, as we can see in the picture. In the 1947 UN partition plan, the coastal aquifers in the left were the only sources of water within Israel's border. Excluded were the Kinneret and mountain aquifers. After 1967, Israel's national water company, Maidrand, controls major water resources in the southern part of the West Bank. It supplies water to the Palestinian Water Authority. And Israel's technological advantages is also reflected in the number, depth, and extraction capacity of its wells. Its ability to drill deeper wells has depleted the shallower Palestinian wells. And until its withdrawal from Gaza in 2007, Israel maintained control over Gaza's groundwater. As a result of long-term overpumping of groundwater, the aquifer in the Gaza Strip has been flooded with seawater, and more than 97% of the water is not fit for drinking. The water supply for the occupied territories is generally determined through agreements negotiated with Israel. Dima Nazir argues that the per capita water footprint, which stands for the extent of water used in relation to consumption by people, in the West Bank, the footprint is below the global average and is only 21% of Israel's. So about Israel's military and coercive means, the unfair distribution of water between Israel and Palestine shows Israel's military strength to protect water security, and it is a direct manifestation of the imbalance of power. Israel has linked cross-border water resources with national security issues. As competition for shared water resources intensifies, the interaction between controversial water allocation policies and unbalanced power structures has become more pronounced. In the West Bank, Israel has imposed military control over water allocation and integrated West Bank water resources into Israel's national water system since August 1967. Military Order 92 authorized army officers to limit Palestinian water quotas and placed limits on the depths of Palestinian wells, froze funds for water construction in Arab municipalities, and set the cost for water for Palestinians' water far higher than for Jewish settlers. And Order 291 declared the water resources of the West Bank to be Israeli state property, and Order 498 in 1974 restricted the expansion of Palestinian agriculture and prohibited Palestinian cultivation of citrus and imposed a water quota system on Gaza. Only Israel has the authority to issue permits, set water quotas, and regulate water prices. Israel's construction of the separation wall in 2003 hindered access for many Palestinians to their wells located on the other side of the wall. And finally, about water diplomacy. In the Israeli-Palestinian water negotiations, agenda setting is an important factor in the long-term difficulty in reaching an agreement. In the setting of the negotiation agenda, the Palestinian side tends to view the issue of water resources from the perspective of rights. Their primary demands is for ownership and sovereignty of water. Israel, however, argues that the ownership of aquifers is non-negotiable. Israel demands that technical, less controversial issues, including the joint development of water resources, be the initial content of the negotiations. The whole process of water development, management, and transportation require technical supports and financial guarantees. Israel has more resources in these areas compared with Palestinians, of course. And this enables Israel to set the agenda in water negotiations. The Palestinians depend on Israel even for clean water and sewage treatment. Therefore, most of the initial agreements reached between Israel and the Palestinian National Authority focused on water development and cooperation and postponed indefinitely the issue of water sovereignty, just as demanded by Israel. The importance of Israeli-Palestinian economic cooperation has gone far beyond the economy itself. For the Palestinians, cooperation with Israel provides them with basic living conditions and space for development. Climate change and population growth continue to increase the Palestinian demand for water, and Israel's advantages power in this production and knowledge structure is resulting in Palestinians increasingly dependent on Israel. At the beginning of the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian National Authority envisioned achieving statehood within 5 years, but as the negotiations stalled, what was supposed to be a short-term transitional arrangement gradually became the status quo in Israeli-Palestinian relations. Structural power relationship enabled Israel to keep this status quo. So my conclusion is, Palestine is constrained by Israel in security, production, finance, and knowledge structure, which reduces the Palestine's ability to establish an independent state. Since February 2018, the Palestinians threatened to terminate economic ties with Israel, and again in 2020, when President Trump released new Middle East peace plan, the Palestinian National Authority again announced their withdrawal from the economic and security cooperation with Israel. However, the Palestinians never really canceled their cooperation with Israel, because to do so would result in the Palestinian National Authority to maintain domestic security and order in the West Bank, while Hamas would probably challenge the PLO's legitimacy. The resulting exclusion of Palestinian workers in Israel would sink the Palestinian economy. The Palestinian monetary and banking systems would have problems functioning in the short term. Palestine would face an overall humanitarian crisis due to its lack of independent capacity in industrial, agricultural, and domestic water and sewage treatment. To sum up, the withdrawal of Israeli-Palestinian cooperation would have a greater negative impact on the Palestinians, while its impact on Israel would be limited. The outbreak of COVID-19 has aggravated this imbalance of power. In November 2020, due to the economic and health crisis, Palestine had to start receiving some of the tax transfers from Israel, and this breakup was virtually ended. The asymmetrical structural power gives Israel the room for negotiation and concession in the Palestinian-Israel negotiations, which make it almost impossible for Israel to put pressure for Palestine to put pressure on Israel through decoupling. The asymmetrical power relationships has impeded the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. As a result, it becomes harder to achieve a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Of course, the issue is the control of resources. In this case, it's water. But our next presentation, it's going to be about land, specifically biblical sites in Israel. And the point is the control of resources in order to favor Israel's geopolitical position. And our next speaker is Jennifer Maidrand from Churches for Middle East Peace, which is a non-governmental organization based in Washington, D.C. Jennifer is a PhD candidate as well in Bible and Cultures at Drew University, and her research focuses on how biblical interpretation and archaeology have shaped the contemporary land of Palestine, Israel, and its geopolitics. So I now pass the floor to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Sorry, I was just getting the tech configurations done on my end. Thank you so much for organizing and for having us here today. Thank you to my colleague, Xuan, for your amazing presentation on water. I'll be kind of continuing in a similar vein, but as Daniel said, talking about land. So my apologies here. Let me just get my presentation pulled up here. Okay, so like Daniel said, I work for Churches for Middle East Peace, which is a nonprofit organization based in the US, and we aim to equip Christians with educational resources around peace building in the Middle East with the goal that they might be mobilized to advocate for a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. So today I will be talking about green space, the green line, and the role of the Bible in East Jerusalem. And so just to give a quick overview here, this is a part of a larger research project for me, and I'm going to be sharing just a little bit about it today. But essentially looking at biblical archaeology's participation in the construction of a national biblical narrative of the land and how that has actually affected the borders of the land and its geopolitics. And so I'm going to be looking at and theorizing around how particular sites in East Jerusalem construct scriptural realities that are simultaneously shaping the land's geopolitical contours. And so before I get going here into the bulk of my research today, I just want to touch on two historic projects in Palestine historically in the late 19th, early 20th century that were a part of constructing the foundation for the geopolitical utilization of the Bible. And so the first is biblical archaeology. And so simultaneous with the emergence of Western Christian interest in Palestine, as the land of the Bible was the mobilization of evangelical theology for British imperial interests in Palestine, and this intersected with biblical archaeology as a project. And so oftentimes this kind of new scientific study developed out of this Western Christian imperial understanding that Christians had claim to the land of the Bible. And so we see that here in the work of Adolf Diesmann. And so the second that I want to touch on is cartography vis-a-vis the British Empire. And so in the late 1800s, Great Britain was immensely interested in the land of Palestine, first to uphold the Ottoman Empire that was currently occupying Palestine, and later for their own occupation of land. And so these imperial colonial interests ended up bolstering what came to be the development of biblical archaeology in the land. And so as British geographers, engineers, archaeologists set out to recover the land of the Bible and remap the land of Palestine to match a particular biblical history, that sort of set the stage for a later kind of reconstruction in a way of the Bible in Palestine. And so I just want to touch on this ideology that was present in that of Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, and is also present at large in biblioarchaeology in the land today. And so this understanding that there's kind of this unbroken line of continuity between the Bible and the Joshua of conquest, and the narratives of conquest of the land of Canaan, and to that sort of continuing today into what is now known as Israel. And so biblical archaeology provided a sort of scientific foundation upon which the land of Palestine could be claimed as a land for the Jewish people and for Christians to stake claim to it as well. And the Bible was used in a very similar way in the colonization of Palestine that it was to the Americas, understanding the land as promised to the settlers over and against the native inhabitants of the land. And so what I'm going to be drawing on here as I look at some particular examples of the ongoing kind of biblicization of land in East Jerusalem is the work of a biblical scholar. My training is actually in biblical studies. And so I'm drawing upon a scholar, Vincent Wimbush, who has this notion of scripturalization. And he defines it as a social, psychological, political structure establishing its own reality. And so for Wimbush, scripturalization is not really about the scriptures themselves, but the realities that they create. And so he talks about how scriptures are used oftentimes in imperial colonial settings to shape ideological, discursive, national, social, cultural narratives. And I'm arguing in this case are actually physically shaping the land themselves. And so what I'm going to be working with is this understanding that scriptures construct reality. And so I'm going to look at how that intersects with the preservation of biblical historical sites in East Jerusalem and how that intersects with national parks as well. And so this is what is being done in East Jerusalem, scriptures constructing realities, and in particular along the Green Line. So I'm going to be looking at the city of David, which is a site that began excavation in 1867. It was a crucial site for one of the sort of leading figures of early biblical archaeology, Charles Warren. It was a crucial site for him to prove the Davidic occupation of Jerusalem, the historic biblical occupation of Jerusalem. And so this site is located just south of the old city of Jerusalem currently. The city of David is part of the Jerusalem Walls City of David National Park, which was declared a national park in Israel in 1974. And it serves as a sort of green belt around the old city. We'll see a couple of maps in just a moment of how that really plays out. But it's a national park that kind of wraps around the old city, almost completely encompasses it. And it's bordered on the east by the Kidron Stream, and its southern section includes the Hinnom Valley, as well as neighborhoods. We're going to talk about a few of those neighborhoods in just a minute, but Xuan is one of the biggest neighborhoods that's currently under threat. And so I just want to touch briefly on the current development of the city of David as a tourist site, as an archaeology site, and as a green space, a national park. And so the city of David does sit right on the Green Line, which is the armistice line of 1949. It formed the de facto border between Israel and what was left of historic Palestine after the 1948 war. And then again was shifted after the 1967 Six-Day War, which sort of created the precedent for that line and that border to continue to be moved, and for Israel's borders to continue to expand. And so I want to just touch on the kind of the sticky part of the management for City of David, in that it is managed by a private organization called the Ir David Foundation, or Amitat Elad. This organization was founded by David Beery, who left the Israeli army in the late 90s, early 2000s, and founded this organization in hopes of quote unquote revitalizing the area of Xuan. And what this has meant in practice is actually Judaizing this part of East Jerusalem, and developing it through historic sites, through national parks and public spaces, and in that process displacing Palestinian homes and erasing the presence of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And so it's very clear that the Ir David Foundation understands themselves as an authoritative organization, and they work quite closely with the Jerusalem municipality, and so much so that several nonprofits have begun, or have been for, I'll say, 10 to 15 years, monitoring their work. And so Yoni Mizrahi of the Israeli NGO Emek Shaveh understands that organizations like Elad are not actually seeking to preserve history or antiquities, but there are political motives underlying the work that they're doing. And so he says the aim is to intensify the Israeli presence, erase the Green Line, both psychologically and physically, and edge the Palestinians out. And so by this he means they are developing and growing the city of David and all of its sort of conglomerate sites with very particular political intent, and in particular along the Green Line, which contains land that is the most vulnerable if we're thinking of a Palestinian presence in East Jerusalem. And so here I want to just take a moment to look at this map. And so in addition to the city of David really serving as kind of a site of biblical tourism for tourists, mostly international tourists that come, it also serves as a site for education, and in a certain way teaching a singular narrative of the biblical history to the present, of this kind of line of continuation to both tourists and to Israelis. And so I just want to point out here, the Aggregate compound is a place where education happens for IDF soldiers. So biblical historical education is part of the education of every soldier in the Israeli Defense Forces. And so the Ir David Foundation has actually uses part of the portfolio of City of David to do so. Another thing that I want to flag here is number 14, this big blue area. And this is a current plan what is called the Al-Bustan plan. And this plan proposes to develop a public green space intended to model after the quote unquote the King's Garden, and so to recreate King's Gardens from perhaps the time of King Solomon or David, if we're thinking in biblical terms here. If you can see underneath the blue, this is in fact a neighborhood, and so this neighborhood is the neighborhood of Al-Bustan, is the Arabic name for the neighborhood, and so there is currently a plan that has been put on hold for the last several years to demolish that neighborhood and to create this public green space atop of it. And so if that were to happen, that would greatly expand the development of the city of David and sort of the real estate that it holds in this area of East Jerusalem. And so this is what I mean by my statement that scriptures are being used to construct realities along the green line, realities that construct biblical history in the presence and erase any semblance of a Palestinian history or presence in that area. And so there have been many houses that have been ordered for demolition in this area, some that have been put on pause, and there's currently, there have not been updates on this case and on this plan until I believe the last updates were August of 2021. And so we're certainly in a period of waiting here. And again, this area highlighted in yellow is that same neighborhood of Al-Bustan. And so I already gave a few of these details, but you can see the area that's proposed for demolition here. And so 49 of those homes that were set to be demolished last year were delayed until February 2022, but there still has not been an update on those cases. And so then if you look on this map on the left as well, you can get a picture of this the City Walls National Park. The light green area includes the city of David and includes the rest of the park surrounding the old city. And in here in the dark green area, you can see the proposed area for expansion. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I do just want to flag this as well. Another proposed project from the Ir David Foundation is an expansion plan that has been on the table since 2017, and this includes the development of a cable car that would connect the city of David, Mount Zion, the Kedem compound, and the future Davidson Center or future Museum of the Bible. And so this is a plan for a literal cable car that goes over several neighborhoods of East Jerusalem in order to link various tourist sites and green spaces that again kind of link together the singular narrative of a line of history that starts in the Bible and continues until today. And by presenting that singular narrative in the process, there are centuries of history that are lost in between. Right, there are centuries of history of occupations other than those resembled in biblical history that are lost in that process. And so again, the history and presence of Palestinians in this area are erased with projects like this, which organizations such as Emek Shaveh have been reporting on and fighting against, and these proposals have been pushed back time and time again, but yet are still viable options on the table. And I just want to highlight here as well that the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions, or ICAD, they talk about this kind of expansion in areas of East Jerusalem as the Judaization of Jerusalem, which in itself, right, on its own does not sound like a bad thing, but when it is weaponized in such a way, right, to gain vulnerable territory and again to erase a Palestinian presence in Jerusalem, this is where it becomes a very, very big concern of those living in the neighborhoods, of activists, and really of anyone who cares about a just and lasting peace in this city and in Palestine and Israel, more broadly speaking. And so something related to the Jerusalem Walls National Park that I want to flag here is actually a quite recent development. So in February of this year, several heads of churches of Jerusalem declared opposition against a new proposal that Israel Nature and Parks Authority put out. And this proposal would designate large spaces of the Mount of Olives, which borders the Old City to the east, and it would designate several other areas very close to the maps that we've just been looking at in the Xuan area south of the Old City. It would designate several of those areas, 68 acres in total, to be encompassed into the national park. And so along with kind of the research that I've been going through around the expansion of the city of David itself, a lot of activist organizations have spoken out with very similar concerns that this expansion plan is really one that threatens both a Palestinian Christian and other Christian presences around the Old City and in East Jerusalem, and of course threatens any Palestinian presence in those areas. And so as soon as this statement was released in opposition, the INPA announced that it would be withdrawing its project. And then very shortly after, it then appeared again on the docket to be discussed in August of this year. And so I do just want to flag that Churches for Middle East Peace released a statement in support of this church leader's opposition and have directly called on the Biden administration to engage in this issue. And really from the perspective that these holy spaces and this holy land really must be protected for the religious freedom and access of all persons. And this current plan clearly does not do so. And so here we can see a map from Peace Now, another Jerusalem-based NGO. And in the light green, you see the existing national park, and outlined in red are all of the areas for the planned expansion of the park. And so, as I said, this expansion threatens a Palestinian presence in East Jerusalem, as well as a Christian presence in the city, which has existed since the 4th century, and which also exists throughout Palestine more broadly. And so, although the historic presence of Christianity and its holy sites in Jerusalem are rooted in problematic histories of Christian imperialism, as I sort of opened my talk with, there is also a strong history of the indigenous Palestinian church in Jerusalem and throughout Palestine, which has been under threat and rapidly shrinking in the past 73 years, but especially in the last 20 to 30 years. And so again, here we see this particular portion of land that's proposed for the park expansion on the bottom here, that's edging into the Palestinian neighborhood of Abu Tur, and which again is bordering Xuan. So if we think about this proposal in relation to the proposal for the King's Garden, which is this portion right here, just to the right and a little bit north in Xuan, if you begin to put the pieces together, the expansion of the national park becomes quite significant, and that the Palestinian neighborhoods and areas that are threatened become quite significant as well. And so I will just flag here, I won't read the whole quote here for the sake of time, but do just want to flag that several activist organizations have come out with a joint statement against this proposal plan for the expansion of the national park. And they understand the forced displacement of Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah that have been going on for almost a year, quite prominently in the news, but of course longer than that. They understand those displacements, as well as the ones in Xuan, to be linked with this expansion plan of the national park. So the two do not happen in silos, but in fact are really a part of a larger project and a larger kind of ongoing pervasive issue that the spaces that are getting developed for local and international tourism, the green spaces that are being protected, actually mean the Palestinian spaces and presence in East Jerusalem are not being protected, that they are the ones sort of being sacrificed and erased in that process. And so I would like to end here by just kind of coming back to this question of the Bible, which is central in my own research, and pose the question here that as historical sites are developed and preserved, you know, very centered around particular interpretations of biblical text, then can we really separate a biblical promised land from the contemporary land of Israel and its occupation? I have pointed out a few places where I think the land and the text are blurred, where the construction of scriptures, you know, on the ground, on the land itself, are actually altering its realities of borders, of control, and of development. And so I close with that question here today, and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's an interesting question. That's an interesting final question, which, you know, I don't think it's going to be easy to have an answer for it. You know, considering that the Israeli people and Israel in general does insist on being a Jewish state, and so there's a question, you know, of like the revision of history, or going so far back in history, so as in ancient biblical times, in order to shape a modern Israel, which seems contradictory in many ways, but where we can understand where that is coming from. And of course, the annexation of territories has been a constant problem in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but this is somewhat more insidious, really, in the sense that it's being disguised as archaeology or biblical studies, or you know, the redevelopment of land and green spaces. But in the end, it continues to be the annexation of Palestinian territory, little by little. So we have a few questions, and we can start with a question for Xuan. The question is, well, there are a few questions. Are there any non-governmental initiatives to work out water security for Palestine that you know of? And what issues, if any, are there between Israel and its neighbors other than Palestine in regards to water management? The region in general will be increasingly, particularly affected by climate change. So I wonder if similar water conflicts exist between Israel and other countries.
Okay, thank you for the question. Actually, I didn't pay much attention to the nonprofit organizations. So the first question, I think I need to read for like the more readings for it. And about the second one, Israel actually has a dispute with all of its neighbors over the cross-border water management. And
I think we lost Xuan there for a second. Seems like, yep, we did. Well, if she comes back, we'll continue with that question. Let's see.
Oh, I apologize for my technical problems. I didn't know why.
We can hear you. Glad you're back.
Okay, that's great. Oh, I was talking about the water dispute between Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Jordan, and Israel and Syria. There were like negotiations between Israel and Syria over the water resources in Golan Heights and Kinneret, of course, but there were no agreement reached. It was closed in the late 1990s and the beginning of the 21st century, but because of the domestic issues, domestic disputes in the political political parties, the agreement was finally held, and the negotiation between Israel and Jordan over the Jordan River, there were agreements reached as early as 1950. When we dig back to the first negotiation between Israel and Jordan, there were a term in their agreement about the hydropower. They used the water in Jordan River to create electricity. And in the 1994 peace agreement between Israel and Jordan, there were very detailed cooperation plan between the two parts. Like Jordan could use the Kinneret to store its water, and Israel could use those ground channels to transport this water from the north to south. And I remember in 2012 or 2013, yeah, there was a cooperation memorandum among Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. They wanted to implement this program to transport water from the Red Sea to Dead Sea, and Israel would use the Red Sea water to I forgot the word. Yeah, just to transport them into the Dead Sea, and in return, Israel would give Jordan those fresh water from Kinneret. But this program was also halted because of some diplomatic crisis between Jordan and Israel, and also because of the lack of foundation. And in last year, in the new government of Israel, they finally reached an agreement for Israel to increase the water supply for Jordan. And this time Palestine didn't join, but it could be seen as a better start for the two parts to renegotiate on the water supplies and water arrangement for the cross-border waters. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Although it would seem that in all the types of international agreements that Israel signs, the Palestinians are usually sidelined. And so it might be more difficult for the Palestinians to come to agreement about water management with Israel than it might be for Jordan or Lebanon to do it. And so it seems that while they're all busy trying to figure out this management, the Palestinians are simply being sidelined. Would you say that?
I think I would agree that it is very hard for Israel and Palestine to reach this agreement for water management alone. But with the cooperation with Jordan, there might be a better solution. But we still need to see.
Which is interesting because that takes us back to the opening plenary today about the need for Jordanian cooperation towards any agreement between Israel and Palestine. Well, thank you for your answer. We have a couple more questions. Question for Jennifer. How do you think the international community takes Israel's claims over territories under the guise of archaeology? Do you think it's an effective approach for Israel to cement rights over territories? Has there been any pushback or condemnation about any sites specifically? UNESCO, for example?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question, Dana. And I think first I will say I think it is largely effective, the use of archaeological sites as a way to not only kind of authorize a claim to land, but also authorize a particular narrative as well. And I think although there are some international organizations and some countries in particular that will speak out against that, the use of archaeology for annexation, I would say those have not affected the management of those sites on the ground, and they remain highly effective by nature of tourist traffic and international support. The City of David in particular has really strong support from Christian Zionist organizations, primarily based in the United States. They have a strong relationship with CUFI, which is Christians United for Israel. And so this sort of gets to another question that someone else had asked as well. But even with this question of UNESCO, in the case of the Tomb of Rachel, which is a site that exists in between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, traditionally has been an interfaith site, is a site that's recognized as holy by Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and yet was, with the building of the separation barrier in the early 2000s around Bethlehem, the site was surrounded on 3 sides by the separation barrier, and now is only accessible to those who enter from Israel, largely is international Christian tourists or Israeli settlers who live in the area are those who most often traffic the site. And so although UNESCO spoke up against the decision to, Netanyahu designated it as a Jewish site, as a UNESCO heritage site, and UNESCO pushed back and said, you know, this is actually a site that has a lot of significance for Muslims as well. And so there was a change in language about the description of the site, and yet there's a complete barrier in terms of who can access the site, as well as, again, something that has been mentioned time and time again about the nature of the separation barrier and its work, you know, to cut away small pieces of land for annexation, that it cuts more and more into the occupied Palestinian territories. And so Rachel's tomb is one of those where it is actually an archaeology site that sort of authorizes the building of the wall in that way to cut into Bethlehem. So that's one example there.
So, you know, publicly, we hear a lot against the Israeli annexation of Palestinian territories, but it doesn't seem like we hear as much about the specific way of claiming territories. So do you think there needs to be more awareness about these projects and why they are problematic, and what is happening deeper beyond the face of mere biblical and tourism sites? Do you feel it's not as talked about as just the general issue of annexation?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think my simple answer would be yes. It would be extremely helpful for there to be, you know, more of a public conversation around this. I wouldn't make the claim that biblical archaeology is the tool that is kind of doing the majority of the work that, you know, that's undergirding annexation of Palestinian territory. I wouldn't make that claim. But yet I think the information that the average, I'm speaking here just from some of my own research, that the average kind of, let's say, tourist to the land, or the average, you know, Christian pilgrim or a Jewish pilgrim to the land has, they're often visiting these sites and only sort of seeing the narrative that's on the surface or that's told to them by a tour guide. And so I think in large part, the participation of the public in, you know, kind of re-ingraining the authority of these sites and the narratives that they tell is lessening that chance to really see how that site is working in a geopolitical way. So I think, yes, it is something that needs to be talked about and is something that would be really helpful, you know, to have resources on for the majority of folks who are interacting with the land, or maybe even not, right, who are getting their information from afar and who hear, you know, will hear a variety of things based on their news source, but to have some specifics tied to the language of annexation, I think, would only be helpful, especially for, again, from my perspective, from a lot of Christians who have this interest in the land and oftentimes a fondness for it, and yet a lack of understanding when it comes to the particularities of how religious histories intersect with the geopoliticization of the land and the annexation of it.
That's a good point. Yes. We have one last question also for Jennifer. Are there any statistics as to where the money comes from to fund these development projects? Might we assume there is a lot of support from the Israeli government?
Before I answer, I just want to give Xuan a chance. I know that you had your hand raised. I don't want to take up all the space here.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm sorry. There is just one question also for Jennifer, because I'm also very interested in your topic. My PhD thesis is actually about the religion and state building of Israel. So I learned a lot from your presentation today. And my question is, do you think the narrative from the biblical archaeology or the promised land is kind of a building of political myth for the state's construction?
Yeah, I'm grateful for your question. It sounds like we should probably connect offline about our research. So I'm grateful for that connection. I think in a lot of ways, yes, I think the construction of a biblical, the particular interpretation of promised land and this construction of a biblical historical narrative, I think in a lot of ways, it serves as a contemporary narrative. There are a lot of lines that are drawn, ways that it's nuanced to make it applicable to the contemporary nation state. But I think there's extensive research, on the ways in which early Jewish Zionist settlers, were actually using the biblical narrative and really not in a non-religious way, right? Without some of those religious commitments, but yet holding up these religious narratives as ones, as a sort of guide to the establishment of a new nation state and of a new historical narrative. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting research that's been done on the early Bible studies that Ben Gurion did on the book of Joshua. And the relationship that he drew between the book of Joshua and the formation of the IDF. And so I think there's a lot of rich, history there for study. But I think it's certainly the biblical histories are a very viable contemporary narrative for Christians as well. And so, I'll leave it there for now, but I would just agree and echo even what you articulated there. Regarding the question about funding, I'm going to put in the chat, there's a really great bit of research done by Rachel Poser at Harper's Magazine on the development of the city of David more recently under the leadership of the Ir David Foundation. And she gets a little bit into this question of funding. I myself have done some digging into the funding of Amitat Alad or the Ir David Foundation because I'm very curious. And so what research has shown thus far is that while there is support, there are dollars that are funded from the Israeli government. There's a lot of international support. There are a lot of big donors that are conservative American Christians that are sort of billionaires that are donating. There was a gathering of some in the Trump administration and of some kind of Republican billionaires over the kind of soft opening of one of the more recent developments of a a tunnel that was dug under Xuan for the city of David that was believed to be a pilgrim road. And so there have been links to a couple of conservative Christian billionaires to funding the David Foundation. And my guess is that those who are kind of in support and special invites to those gatherings are providing strong support in some significant way, whether financial or otherwise, to support the project. And like I said before, I know that Christians United for Israel also have a strong connection with the David Foundation. And I can't make any declarative statements about that, but I know that Christian Zionist organizations such as those tend to have significant funding and often, share that funding where their beliefs are. So I'll just leave it at that.
And of course, former President Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and he did have some pretty deep pocket donors, conservative, Christian, Jewish, and it just makes sense, Then again, I understand your point, but yes, it makes sense that little by little there's all this funding going towards little by little claiming rights over all these lands that unfortunately, as you were saying before, is not an issue of public debate as is the general annexation of territories. Well, there are no more questions. Thank you both very much for being here. I'm glad you met each other because these presentations were related to each other. And we thought that when we were putting together the program. So I remind everyone that we'll have videos of all the conference sessions posted next week in our website. We will let you know, we'll send you an email. So thank you again.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Daniel, for organizing this meeting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so
you.
much for organizing. And again, I'm grateful to connect with you both and for the conversation.
Me too.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Good day.